They grew up in poverty and bought land that everyone else had abandoned. An ordinary plot on the outskirts of town seemed like their only chance to start a new life. But an old shed found on that land hid a secret untouched for decades. When the brothers finally decided to open it, the past suddenly changed their future forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The land had never been meant for people like them. At least, that was what the city had decided long before either brother was born. It lay far beyond the last line of working streetlights, beyond the bus routes and the forgotten sidewalks where concrete slowly surrendered to weeds. For decades, it had existed as a blank space on municipal maps, a parcel no one talked about and no one wanted, passed over so many times that its neglect became part of its identity. Yet, for the two brothers who now drove toward it, that forgotten land represented the first real choice they had ever made for themselves. They had grown up learning the weight of limitation early. Their childhood had been shaped by temporary addresses and permanent uncertainty, by the quiet understanding that stability was something other families possessed. Each move had promised improvement and delivered only variation. Different walls with the same cracks, different neighborhoods carrying the same exhaustion. They learned how to make little stretch far, how to read moods in adults before words were spoken, how to stay alert without appearing afraid. Their bond formed not out of sentiment, but necessity, forged by shared nights listening to unfamiliar sounds and shared mornings pretending everything was normal. As they grew older, the world did not suddenly open its doors. Jobs came and went, always fragile, always conditional. Opportunities hovered just close enough to be visible, then slipped away. Still, they worked. They saved what they could. They carried with them a quiet determination that refused to turn into bitterness. Neither brother spoke often about dreams, but both shared the same unspoken image of a place that could not be taken from them. A place with walls they chose and ground that belonged to no landlord. The listing appeared one evening after another long day that had delivered nothing remarkable. An online auction, barely noticed among dozens of others, offering a piece of land on the outskirts of town. The description was short and unenthusiastic. No utilities, no guarantees, no development history. The price was so low it felt almost insulting, as if the land itself had been stripped of value by reputation alone. Comments left by previous viewers dismissed it as useless, cursed, or simply forgotten. They read the listing more than once. Each time the same thought returned, quiet but persistent. This was a land no one else wanted, which meant no one would fight them for it. There was no illusion that it would be easy. The terrain looked uneven, overgrown, stubborn, but for the first time the obstacles seemed honest. They bid cautiously, expecting to be outmatched at the last moment. No one challenged them. When the auction closed, the confirmation felt unreal, as if the system had made a mistake. The drive to see the land for the first time carried a strange mix of excitement and restraint. Neither brother spoke much as the city thinned behind them. Buildings gave way to open stretches where the horizon felt wider and lonelier. The road narrowed, then cracked, then dissolved into gravel. With each mile, the world they knew receded, replaced by something quieter and less defined. When they reached the gate, there was no sign to announce arrival, no marker to suggest importance. Just rusted metal leaning slightly inward, as though even the boundary had grown tired. They stepped out of the car and stood still for a moment, listening. The air carried no traffic noise, no distant voices. Only wind moving through dry grass and the occasional call of unseen birds. It felt untouched, not peaceful, but waiting. The land stretched farther than they expected. Uneven ground rose and dipped gently, dotted with shrubs and stubborn weeds that had claimed ownership long ago. Trees clustered at the edges, their presence forming a loose perimeter that felt deliberate, though neither brother could have explained why. As they walked, they tried to imagine where a house might stand, where a path could be cleared, where life could eventually take shape. The vision remained vague, more feeling than plan, but it was enough. Then they saw it. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a darker shape against the muted tones of the land. As they moved closer, its outline sharpened, resolving into a structure that immediately felt out of a place. A shed stood near the center of the property, solitary and unmoving, its silhouette too deliberate to be accidental. It was old, that much was clear, but age alone did not explain its presence. The metal walls were rusted, yet intact. The roof sagged slightly, but had not collapsed. The doors faced forward, aligned with a confidence that suggested intention rather than convenience. They stopped several feet away. Neither brother needed to say it. This building had not been mentioned. It had not appeared on the maps or documents they had reviewed after the purchase. There was no explanation for it, no record, no note in the auction listing. It simply existed, as if the land itself had chosen to keep one secret. Curiosity edged out caution. They circled the structure slowly, noting details that raised more questions than answers. The metal used in its construction was thicker than expected. The hinges were heavy, industrial, designed to bear weight and resist force. A large lock secured the doors together, its surface worn but unbroken. This was not the kind of shed someone threw together to store tools. It had been built to last, and perhaps more importantly, to stay closed. The brothers exchanged a look that carried both doubt and intrigue. Whatever they had purchased, it was more than empty land. The shed stood as proof that something had once mattered here, enough for someone to build and protect it. The realization shifted the tone of their excitement, grounding it in uncertainty. The land was no longer a blank canvas. It was a page already written on, though the words had faded. As the sun lowered, casting longer shadows across the uneven ground, the brothers stepped back and took in the scene as a whole. The forgotten land, the silent perimeter of trees, the unexplained structure at its heart. It felt less like ownership and more like inheritance, though neither could have said why. They had come seeking a future. Instead, they had stumbled into a past that refused to remain buried. They returned to their car as dusk approached, carrying with them a sense that the decision they had made could not be undone. The shed remained behind them, unchanged, patient. Whatever it held, whether answers or consequences, it had already begun to shape their path. The land they thought no one wanted had revealed its first truth. It had never been empty at all. The shed did not leave their thoughts after they drove away. Even as the road carried them back toward the familiar edges of the city, its image remained fixed in their minds with an unsettling clarity. The land itself had felt quiet and open, almost forgiven in its neglect, but the structure standing at its center carried a different weight. It was not merely old. It felt intentional, as though it had been placed there to endure time rather than surrender to it. That distinction lingered with them long after the horizon swallowed the property from view. They returned the next morning earlier than planned. Sleep had been shallow and fragmented, filled with half-formed images of rusted doors and unseen interiors. The air was cooler when they arrived, the light softer, revealing details they had missed the day before. Dew clung to the grass, and the land seemed almost unchanged by their brief absence, as if it had been waiting for them to resume what they had begun. The shed appeared exactly as it had before, neither more inviting nor more threatening. From a distance, it seemed smaller than their memory of it, but as they approached, its presence grew again, regaining its quiet dominance over the space. Up close, the signs of age were undeniable. Rust bloomed across the metal in uneven patterns, layers built up over decades. Yet, the structure held firm. There were no holes, no breaches, no signs of collapse. The roof, though bowed slightly under the burden of years, had not given in. They examined it more carefully this time, allowing themselves to notice the craftsmanship that had escaped them in their initial surprise. The panels were joined with precision. The frame was reinforced in ways unnecessary for a simple storage building. Even the placement of the shed felt deliberate, positioned not for convenience but for alignment, as though its location had been calculated rather than chosen at random. The lock drew their attention again. It was heavy, its metal dulled but solid, bearing scratches that suggested attempts to force it open long ago. The chain connecting the doors was thick, the links close set and sturdy. Whoever had secured it had not intended for it to be opened easily. The brothers stood before it in silence, aware that crossing this threshold meant more than satisfying curiosity. It meant choosing to disturb something that had been left undisturbed for a very long time. Eventually, necessity overtook hesitation. They had bought the land, and the structure stood upon it. Ignoring it would not make it disappear. They searched the surrounding ground, scanning for anything that might help them gain entry without causing unnecessary damage. Among scattered debris and half-buried remnants of forgotten materials, they found what they needed. A length of steel pipe lay partially hidden beneath weeds, weathered but intact. It fit their hands with surprising familiarity, as though it had been waiting for this exact purpose. The effort took time. The chain resisted at first, absorbing their force with a stubborn resilience. The sound of metal straining against metal echoed across the empty land, sharp and intrusive in the stillness. With each attempt, the tension grew, not only in the chain, but within them. Finally, with a sound that cracked the air like a sudden release of breath, the lock gave way. The chain fell loose, clattering against the doors before settling into silence. For a moment, neither brother moved. The shed stood open to them now, no longer sealed by its own defenses. They pulled the doors apart carefully. Hinges groaned in protest, their voices rough with age. The opening revealed darkness within, dense and unyielding. A stale smell escaped, heavy with dust and time, carrying the unmistakable presence of something long closed off from the world. They stepped inside cautiously, allowing their eyes to adjust as their flashlights cut narrow paths through the gloom. The beam illuminated metal walls from the inside, marked with scratches and stains that hinted at past activity. The floor was solid beneath their feet, free of the rot they had expected. Whatever this place had been, it had been built to endure. As the light swept across the interior, shapes began to emerge. In one corner stood several large wooden boxes, stacked carefully rather than scattered. Their surfaces were worn but intact, reinforced with metal bands. Smaller locks secured their lids, each one different, yet all clearly chosen for strength rather than appearance. The boxes looked less like abandoned junk and more like something deliberately stored. The brothers approached them slowly, their sense of unease mingling with fascination. The boxes were arranged with order, spaced evenly, as though someone had planned their placement down to the smallest detail. Dust lay thick on their surfaces, but it had not penetrated inside. Time had passed over them without fully claiming them. Opening the first box felt like crossing another threshold. The lid creaked softly as it lifted, revealing neatly stacked documents wrapped in protective layers. Papers, yellowed with age, but preserved with care, lay inside, their edges crisp, their surfaces unblemished by moisture. There were photographs as well, sepia-toned images of a man and his family, posed with solemn expressions that spoke of a different era. Their faces carried a seriousness that felt both distant and familiar, as though they belonged to a time when permanence still seemed possible. Another box revealed rolled sheets of paper tied with faded ribbon. When they unfurled them, they realized they were looking at blueprints. Not simple drawings, but complex plans filled with precise lines and measurements. The level of detail was extraordinary. Walls, corridors, stairways, and spaces beneath the ground were all rendered with mathematical exactness. These were not sketches or concepts. They were instructions meant to be followed. The brothers studied the drawings in silence, instinctively aware that they were holding something significant. The plans depicted more than a single building. They suggested an entire system, a structure that extended beyond what could be seen on the surface. Some areas were shaded, marked with symbols they did not immediately understand. Yet, even without full comprehension, the intention was clear. This had been designed by someone with vision, resources, and time. What drew their attention most was the signature. In the corner of every sheet, a set of initials appeared, enclosed within an inverted triangular symbol. The mark was bold and fluid, standing in contrast to the rigid precision of the lines surrounding it. It felt personal, almost defiant, as though the creator had wanted to leave undeniable proof of authorship. The initials meant nothing to them yet, but the consistency with which they appeared suggested importance. They continued through the remaining boxes, finding more of the same. Documents detailing financial holdings, land records, and correspondence written in a careful, deliberate hand. Everything pointed to a level of wealth and organization far beyond what they had imagined. This was not the legacy of a modest landowner. This was the archive of someone who had controlled vast assets and had taken extraordinary measures to preserve his work. As they explored, the initial excitement gave way to something deeper. The shed was no longer simply an unexpected structure. It was a gateway to a story that had been intentionally hidden. The care taken to protect these materials spoke of foresight and distrust, of someone who had planned for the future but had not trusted it entirely. When they finally stepped back into the daylight, carrying their discoveries with them, the land felt different. The open space seemed charged with unseen connections, the ground beneath their feet less inert than before. The shed, now empty of its secrets, but not of its significance, stood behind them like a sentinel that had fulfilled its first purpose. They loaded the boxes carefully into their car, aware that they were transporting more than old papers. They were carrying fragments of a life that had been deliberately erased. As they drove away, the weight of what they had found settled over them. The land had revealed its second truth. It had not only been claimed once before, but claimed by someone who had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that his legacy would not fall into the wrong hands. Whatever answers lay ahead, they would not be found on the surface. And whatever path awaited them next, it had already been drawn long ago, in ink and intention, waiting patiently in the dark for someone willing to open the door. The boxes followed them into the next days like a quiet presence, occupying more than physical space. They were placed carefully in the small room the brothers used as a shared workspace, stacked against the wall where the light was strongest. At first glance, they appeared inert, nothing more than old wood and paper. But the brothers quickly realized that what they had brought back from the land refused to remain passive. Every time they entered the room, their attention was pulled toward the boxes, toward the weight of what lay inside them. The shed had been left behind, but its contents had come with them, and with them came a growing sense of obligation. They began methodically, knowing instinctively that rushing would only lead to confusion. Each document was handled with care, each photograph examined closely before being set aside. The handwriting varied slightly across the papers, but the underlying precision remained consistent. Whoever had created this archive had done so with intent, organizing his life into records meant to be read, understood, and preserved. There was no chaos here, no randomness. Even the passage of time had not managed to disrupt the order. The initials appeared everywhere. On the corner of blueprints, at the bottom of letters, embossed faintly into seals on envelopes that had never been sent. The inverted triangle enclosing the letters seemed almost ceremonial, a personal emblem rather than a decorative flourish. The brothers found themselves tracing it absent-mindedly, trying to understand why it felt familiar despite having never seen it before. It carried authority, but also restraint, as though it represented power that had chosen to remain controlled. They turned to public records next, driven by the need to anchor their discoveries in something verifiable. Old newspapers became their first source. Hours were spent scrolling through digitized archives, their eyes adjusting to faded print and archaic phrasing. At first, nothing stood out. The name they searched for did not appear. The initials led nowhere. It was as if the man behind them had never existed, or had existed only in private, untouched by the public record. This absence proved more unsettling than any confirmation could have been. Wealth of the scale suggested by the documents could not simply vanish without leaving traces. Businesses, land acquisitions, transactions of such magnitude would have generated attention, controversy, envy, yet the record was almost entirely silent. The few references they did find were vague, indirect, often framed as rumors or passing mentions rather than concrete facts. A benefactor unnamed, a landowner referred to only by title, a figure spoken of without detail as if deliberate caution had shaped every word. Gradually, patterns began to emerge, dates aligned across different sources. Locations mentioned in the documents corresponded to properties that still existed, though under different ownership. Entire sections of the city, now ordinary and unremarkable, had once been part of a single, vast network of holdings. The brothers realized they were not looking for a forgotten man. They were looking for a man who had been erased. The scale of his wealth became clearer as they connected more pieces. He had owned industries that no longer bore his name, their origins absorbed into corporate histories rewritten over generations. He had controlled land that had been subdivided, sold, repurposed, its original source obscured by time and bureaucracy. At his peak, he had been one of the richest individuals in the region, perhaps beyond it. Yet, his presence in history had been reduced to shadows and omissions. The brothers felt a growing tension between admiration and unease. This man had possessed extraordinary power, yet had chosen to conceal it rather than celebrate it. The documents suggested someone deeply aware of the instability of wealth and the corruption that often followed it. Letters spoke not of ambition, but of restraint, not of conquest, but of protection. He wrote of responsibility in measured terms, as though aware that unchecked fortune could become destructive. The question of his disappearance lingered heavily. There was no clear record of his death, no obituary bearing his name, no public inheritance dispute. Instead, there was a sudden silence that fell across the timeline, a point after which he simply ceased to be mentioned. The brothers speculated privately, though neither voiced their thoughts aloud. It was easier to focus on facts than to imagine motives. What became undeniable was that the erasure had been intentional. Documents hinted at legal maneuvers, at assets quietly transferred or dissolved. Trusts were established and then sealed. Properties were abandoned strategically rather than lost. The shed itself, now understood as a fragment of a larger plan, stood as evidence of foresight. It had not been built for convenience. It had been built to wait. As they studied the blueprints again, new understanding began to take shape. The complexity of the designs suggested not only architectural skill, but strategic thinking. The underground elements were not simply hidden rooms, they were integrated systems designed to exist independently if necessary. Storage, living spaces, archives, all planned with redundancy and security in mind. This was not paranoia. It was preparation. The brothers found themselves wondering what threat had driven such measures. The era in which the man had lived had been marked by upheaval, by rapid change and social division. Wealth, especially in the hands of someone unwilling to conform, would have attracted scrutiny and hostility. It became clear that he had not trusted institutions to safeguard what he had built. Instead, he had trusted time, secrecy, and blood. The realization settled slowly, bringing with it an uncomfortable sense of proximity. The documents did not yet confirm a connection between the brothers and the man they were studying, but the idea no longer felt distant. The land, the shed, the careful preservation all suggested intention directed forward rather than backward. This was not a monument to the past, it was a message to the future. As days passed, the brothers' routines shifted. Their work outside the archive continued, but it felt secondary now, performed with an underlying distraction. Every new discovery pulled them deeper, blurring the line between curiosity and responsibility. They were no longer merely owners of land. They were custodians of a story that had been deliberately hidden, waiting for the right moment to surface. One evening, as they reviewed the blueprints once more, a subtle detail caught their attention. When overlaid mentally with the layout of the land, the plans did not align perfectly with the surface structures they had seen. There was a discrepancy, a missing element that could not be explained by erosion or neglect. A section that existed in the drawings but had no visible counterpart above ground. The shed stood precisely where that absence should have been. The implication was immediate and unsettling. The shed was not simply covering something, it was marking it. The structure they had thought to be an endpoint revealed itself as a beginning, a surface-level fragment of something far more extensive hidden beneath the soil. The man they were studying had not only concealed his wealth in documents and boxes, he had concealed it physically, embedding it into the land itself. The brothers sat with that understanding, letting it settle. The search for a name had led them instead to a place, a location chosen with care and intention. The land they had purchased for a modest future had become the center of a legacy that dwarfed their original plans. The man erased from history had left one final certainty behind. His story was not finished. It had merely been waiting for someone willing to look beneath the surface. The realization did not strike them with sudden excitement, but with a slow, almost heavy certainty. Once the thought had taken shape, it refused to leave. The shed was no longer an isolated structure or an inconvenient mystery standing in the way of their plans. It was a marker. Everything they had uncovered in the documents, every line drawn with such precision on the blueprints, seemed to bend back toward that single point on the land. The absence they had noticed in the plans was not an error, it was an invitation. They returned to the property with a different awareness than before. The land had not changed, yet it felt altered by knowledge alone. Every uneven rise in the ground, every subtle depression, every unnatural straight line in the vegetation now seemed charged with meaning. What had once appeared random began to suggest intention. The brothers moved more slowly this time, no longer walking as owners surveying a purchase, but as investigators stepping onto a carefully constructed stage. The shed greeted them with the same silence as before, but its presence felt diminished. It was no longer the secret itself, only the cover. Standing beside it, they compared what they saw with what they remembered from the blueprints. Measurements replayed in their minds, distances between walls, angles of corridors that no longer existed above ground. The alignment was unmistakable. The shed sat exactly where the missing section of the design should have been, its footprint matching the dimensions of a concealed structure beneath. They began by studying the ground around it. The soil was compacted in places, unnaturally firm compared to the surrounding earth. In other areas it gave slightly underfoot, producing a dull, hollow sound that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The brothers tested these spots carefully, listening, pressing, comparing one section to another. The difference was subtle but consistent, as if something solid lay just below the surface, close enough to be felt but far enough to remain hidden. Digging began cautiously. They worked with hand tools at first, unwilling to risk damaging whatever lay beneath. The soil resisted them, packed tightly as though it had been deliberately compressed. Progress was slow, the work physically demanding, yet neither brother complained. Each shovelful removed felt symbolic, like stripping away a layer of deliberate forgetfulness. As the hole deepened, the texture of the earth changed. Loose dirt gave way to something harder, more structured. Wood emerged first, its surface darkened by age, but preserved by the soil above it. The brothers cleared around it carefully, revealing the outline of a hatch set flush with the ground. Its edges were reinforced with metal, the craftsmanship immediately recognizable as matching the quality they had seen in the shed and the documents. They stood over it in silence, aware that this was a threshold far more significant than the shed doors had been. The hatch represented a deliberate decision made long ago, one that assumed someone would eventually stand exactly where they were now. Opening it meant stepping directly into the heart of the plan that had been drawn and then buried. The hatch opened with effort, releasing a breath of cold, stale air from below. Darkness stretched downward, swallowing the light. A ladder descended into it, its rungs disappearing into blackness after the first few steps. The space felt deep, not cramped, as though it opened into something larger than a simple cellar. They descended carefully, their movements deliberate. The air grew cooler as they went, carrying a faint scent of oil and old wood rather than decay. When their lights reached the bottom, the sight that greeted them defied expectation. This was no crude hiding place or forgotten basement. It was a finished space, enclosed by solid walls, its layout deliberate and measured. The room extended farther than they had anticipated, branching into adjoining areas that revealed themselves gradually as the light spread. Floors were level and intact. Walls bore the marks of age, but not neglect. Furniture stood arranged as though waiting, not abandoned. Tables, shelves, cabinets, all positioned with intention. Dust coated every surface, but beneath it lay order, not ruin. As they moved deeper, the purpose of the space became clearer. This was a living area, not merely a storage vault. Books lined shelves, their spines faded but legible. Personal items rested on tables, preserved in the positions they had been left. Lamps stood ready, and when tested, some still functioned, casting a warm glow that softened the edges of the room and revealed its full scale. The brothers felt a strange intimacy as they explored, as though they were intruding on a private life rather than uncovering a secret. This place had not been designed solely to protect wealth. It had been designed to sustain a person, perhaps even a family, for an extended period of time. Every detail suggested foresight, a plan for continuity rather than escape. Beyond the living area, they discovered an archive. Here, the documents were more extensive, more formal. Ledgers recorded transactions of staggering size. Legal papers detailed trusts, asset transfers, and contingencies that stretched far into the future. Everything was meticulously organized, cross-referenced, and sealed. This was the operational center of a fortune, hidden underground yet functioning in concept long after its creator had vanished. Then there were the vaults. Reinforced doors protected chambers that required careful handling to open. Inside, the scale of the wealth revealed itself fully for the first time. Gold and silver lay stacked in orderly rows, coins and bars arranged not as hoarded treasure but as calculated reserves. Alongside them were documents representing ownership of assets that still existed in the modern world, their value undiminished by time. Yet, what struck the brothers most was not the wealth itself, but the restraint evident in how it had been stored. Nothing here suggested excess or indulgence. The wealth was preserved, not displayed. It was waiting, not demanding attention. This was not the hiding place of a man obsessed with possession. It was the safeguard of someone who viewed wealth as a responsibility rather than an entitlement. Among the documents, they found what they had both anticipated and feared. Legal records tracing lineage, sealed and authenticated, connecting the man who had built this place to generations that followed. Names unfolded across the pages, branching carefully through time. The brothers followed the lines slowly, their attention narrowing with each familiar detail. The connection was undeniable. The bloodline did not end with him. It had continued quietly, obscured by circumstance and deliberate separation. The realization carried weight far beyond excitement. This was not a coincidence, not a fortunate accident of land purchase. The land had been left untouched because it was meant to be. The shed had stood as a guardian, the hatch as a test. The man they had been studying had not vanished without purpose. He had retreated, leaving behind a legacy that required patience, discernment, and resilience to uncover. As they stood in the heart of the underground complex, surrounded by evidence of foresight that spanned generations, the brothers understood that their lives had already shifted. The land was no longer simply a place to build a house. It was the foundation of a responsibility inherited across time. The documents, the wealth, the very structure beneath their feet all pointed toward a single conclusion. What had been hidden was not meant to remain buried forever. It had been waiting for the right hands to uncover it, and for the right minds to decide what should be done next. The underground rooms did not feel like a discovery meant to be celebrated. They felt like a reckoning that had arrived quietly and without ceremony. The brothers remained there longer than they had planned, moving slowly through the space as though speed might break something invisible. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation, not oppressive but deliberate, as if the place had been designed to impose reflection before action. They returned several times over the following days, never rushing, never treating the space as a prize. Each visit revealed details they had missed before. The arrangement of furniture suggested not comfort, but discipline. Nothing was ornate. Nothing was excessive. Every object served a purpose, and every purpose appeared carefully weighed. The man who had built this place had not sought refuge underground out of fear alone. He had sought control, not over others, but over the future of what he owned. The brothers began to read the documents in earnest, no longer skimming for names or connections, but absorbing them fully. Letters written in a steady hand spoke of concern for generations not yet born. There was no sentimentality in the language, no indulgence in legacy for its own sake. Instead, there was a recurring theme of obligation. Wealth, according to these writings, was not proof of worth, but a test of it. The author returned to this idea repeatedly, framing fortune as something inherently unstable unless guided by restraint and moral clarity. Among the papers lay a sealed packet set apart from the others. It was thicker, its edges reinforced, its surface marked with the familiar inverted triangle and initials. Unlike the rest of the archive, this packet bore signs of intentional delay, as though it had been placed last, meant to be opened only after everything else had been understood. The brothers hesitated before unsealing it, aware that this might be the moment when curiosity transformed into commitment. Inside, they found the will. It was not written in dramatic language. There were no grand declarations, no flourish of self-importance. Instead, it read like a set of principles translated into legal form. The man addressed his descendants not as heirs to riches, but as stewards of consequence. He acknowledged the scale of what he had accumulated and expressed no pride in it. Instead, he framed his wealth as something that had grown beyond his ability to ensure its proper use within his own lifetime. The conditions were clear, though not enforced by threats or penalties. He did not demand obedience through fear of loss. Rather, he placed the burden of choice squarely on those who would come after him. The wealth, the land, the assets preserved underground were to be used only in ways that extended opportunity, restored balance, and protected those who had been systematically denied both. Personal enrichment was not forbidden, but it was deliberately deprioritized. The emphasis lay on impact rather than comfort. The brothers read the document in silence, each absorbing its meaning privately. The words did not feel abstract. They felt directed. The author wrote of descendants who might grow up without knowing where they came from, who might struggle under circumstances shaped by forces beyond their control. He anticipated lives marked by endurance rather than privilege. The will did not romanticize hardship, but it acknowledged it with unsettling accuracy. There was no instruction to reveal the discovery publicly, nor to conceal it forever. Instead, the author wrote of discernment, urging his descendants to act not according to recognition or reward, but according to necessity. He warned against spectacle, against the temptation to turn wealth into identity. He spoke of silence as a form of protection and humility as a form of strength. The brothers emerged from the underground space carrying more than knowledge. The weight they felt was not greed nor even excitement, but responsibility. The fortune beneath their feet represented possibilities they had never allowed themselves to imagine, yet the conditions surrounding it prevented those possibilities from becoming indulgence. For the first time, they were not being asked what they wanted, but what they were willing to carry. The days that followed were marked by quiet contemplation. Their routines continued, but every action felt reframed. Ordinary expenses, small ambitions, even idle thoughts now passed through a new filter. The wealth was real, undeniable, yet it did not feel accessible in the way money usually did. It felt conditional, not in a legal sense, but in a moral one. They spoke little to each other during this time, not out of distance, but because words felt insufficient. Each brother grappled privately with the same question. What does it mean to deserve something you did not earn, but were chosen to protect? Their upbringing had taught them to value effort above all else, to distrust anything that came too easily. The inheritance challenged that instinct, offering abundance without struggle, yet demanding something more difficult in return. Eventually, their unspoken deliberation reached a quiet alignment. They returned to the underground archive together and reread the will, this time not as recipients but as participants in an ongoing design. The choice, they realized, was not between taking and refusing. It was between reducing the inheritance to money or expanding it into purpose. They began to plan, not in detail, but in direction. The documents spoke of restoration, of lifting rather than dominating. The brothers thought of the neighborhoods they had come from, the cycles they had watched repeat with numbing predictability. They thought of families like their own, capable and determined, yet perpetually constrained by invisible barriers. The wealth beneath the land could fracture those barriers if applied with care. This understanding did not arrive as a moment of triumph. It settled slowly, accompanied by doubt and caution. They were aware of their own limitations, their lack of experience in managing anything of this scale. The will did not grant them competence, only access. It assumed they would learn, adapt, and make mistakes. What it demanded was sincerity of intent. The brothers accepted the inheritance without ceremony. There was no celebration, no marking of the moment beyond their shared decision to move forward together. They did not see themselves as beneficiaries. They saw themselves as continuations, temporary custodians of something designed to outlast any single life. When they sealed the documents again and secured the underground space, it was not with the sense of closing something away, but of preparing it for use. The land above remained quiet and unchanged, the shed still standing, the surface revealing nothing of what lay beneath. Yet the brothers knew that everything had shifted. The past had extended a hand into the present, not to reclaim power, but to pass it on with intention. What remained now was action. Not immediate, not impulsive, but deliberate. The wealth had survived generations because it had been hidden. Its next chapter would determine whether it deserved to continue existing at all. The decision, once made, did not announce itself with clarity or relief. It settled into the brothers' lives gradually, reshaping their days in ways that were subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. The inheritance no longer felt like a hidden presence beneath the land, sealed behind reinforced doors and legal language. It became an active force, demanding structure, discipline, and an understanding of consequences far beyond personal gain. The underground chambers remained untouched for weeks after their acceptance of responsibility, not out of fear, but out of respect. They understood that acting too quickly would risk turning intention into impulse, and impulse into error. They began where they knew best, not with grand gestures, but with observation. The neighborhoods of their childhood had not changed much since they left them. Buildings still sagged under deferred maintenance. Schools still struggled with shortages that went far beyond funding. Families still lived one emergency away from collapse. What had changed was the brothers' perspective. Where they once saw inevitability, they now saw systems. Where they once felt powerless, they now felt accountable. The first use of the wealth was deliberately modest. They sought advice quietly, consulting professionals without revealing the source of their resources. Legal frameworks were established carefully, shaped to protect longevity rather than speed. Trusts were structured not to concentrate control, but to ensure transparency and continuity. Every decision was measured against the principles outlined in the will, not as rigid commandments, but as a moral compass that refused to allow convenience to override purpose. Housing became their initial focus, not because it promised visibility, but because it promised stability. They funded the renovation of abandoned buildings that had been written off as unsalvageable, transforming them into livable spaces without displacing the communities that surrounded them. Rent was structured to remain affordable, not as charity, but as a foundation for independence. Families moved into homes that no longer felt temporary, and the quiet dignity that returned to those spaces carried a weight far greater than recognition. Employment followed naturally. The brothers invested in small businesses that had been denied traditional financing, prioritizing those rooted in the communities they aimed to support. Workshops reopened. Local services expanded. Jobs were created not as favors, but as partnerships, designed to last beyond initial investment. The wealth beneath the land flowed outward in controlled streams, not flooding lives with excess, but nourishing them with opportunity. Education proved more complex, and therefore more essential. The brothers funded programs that addressed not only access but retention. Scholarships were paired with mentorship. Facilities were improved alongside curricula. They understood that education was not a singular event, but a process easily disrupted by instability elsewhere. Their efforts focused on continuity, ensuring that progress was not erased by circumstance. As their work expanded, so did the need for structure. The brothers resisted the temptation to centralize control, remembering the warnings written into the will. Authority was distributed carefully, oversight built into every layer. They surrounded themselves with people whose perspectives differed from their own, understanding that agreement was less valuable than accountability. The wealth did not make them infallible. It made their mistakes more consequential. Throughout it all, they remained largely invisible. There were no public announcements, no naming rights attached to their efforts. The brothers worked through foundations and partnerships that emphasized collective ownership rather than individual credit. They had learned early in life how easily attention could distort intention, and they refused to let the story become about them. The land itself remained unchanged on the surface. The shed still stood in quiet isolation, its purpose known only to them. Yet beneath it, the underground chambers began to shift in meaning. They were no longer merely a repository of wealth, but a reference point, a reminder of origin. The brothers returned there often, not to admire the fortune, but to recalibrate their choices against the vision that had preserved it for so long. Over time, the effects of their work became visible even without attribution. Neighborhoods stabilized. Small successes accumulated, reinforcing one another. The changes were not dramatic, but they were durable. People began to plan for futures that extended beyond immediate survival. That, more than any metric, affirmed the brothers' path. The blueprints left by their ancestor found new relevance as well. Among the designs were plans not only for the house that had never been built, but for communal spaces, structures intended to bring people together without hierarchy. The brothers recognized the intent immediately. The house was never meant to stand alone. It was meant to anchor something larger. They began preparations to build, not as an act of personal fulfillment, but as a continuation of the original design. The house would rise where it had always been intended to rise, incorporating the principles embedded in its plans. It would not be a monument to wealth, but a working space, a place for collaboration, learning, and reflection. The underground rooms would remain intact, preserved not as secrets, but as safeguards, ensuring that the wealth could never be separated from its purpose. As construction plans took shape, the brothers felt a quiet sense of alignment. Their lives, once defined by limitation, were now defined by responsibility. The inheritance had not elevated them above others. It had bound them more deeply to the world around them. Each decision reinforced the understanding that wealth, when treated as an endpoint, corrupted, but when treated as a tool, transformed. The city began to change in ways that could not be traced back to a single source. Opportunities multiplied. Resilience grew. The brothers watched these shifts from a distance, resisting pride, embracing vigilance. They knew the work was unfinished, and likely always would be. That realization did not discourage them. It grounded them. As the foundation for the house was laid on the land they had once viewed as their escape, they understood that the future they were building was not theirs alone. It belonged to everyone who would benefit from choices made long before they were born and long after they would be gone. The inheritance had survived by remaining hidden. It would endure now by remaining faithful to its purpose. The house did not rise quickly. It emerged from the land the way the truth beneath it had, gradually and without spectacle. The brothers insisted on patience, even when speed was offered as an advantage. They understood that this place, more than any other structure they would ever build, demanded fidelity to intention rather than efficiency. Every line drawn more than a century earlier was studied, respected, and followed with care. The blueprints were not treated as relics, but as instructions still alive with relevance. As the foundation settled into the earth, the connection between past and present became tangible. The stones chosen echoed those specified in the original plans, sourced not for luxury, but for endurance. Walls rose with proportions designed to balance openness and privacy, strength and humility. Nothing about the house sought to dominate the land around it. Instead, it seemed to belong there, as though the ground itself had been waiting for it to return. The underground chambers remained untouched during construction, sealed and protected as they had always been. Workers knew nothing of what lay beneath their feet. The brothers did not hide it out of fear or greed, but out of respect for the design. That space had been created as a safeguard, not a feature. Its purpose was continuity, not display. It would remain exactly what it had always been, a quiet anchor beneath everything else. As the structure took shape, the surrounding land began to change as well. Paths were cleared, not paved, allowing the natural contours to remain visible. Trees were preserved wherever possible, their presence integrated into the layout rather than removed for convenience. The brothers wanted the place to feel lived with, not imposed upon. This had never been meant to be an estate. It was meant to be a home in the oldest sense of the word, a center rather than a boundary. When the house was finally completed, it did not announce itself with grandeur. From a distance, it appeared almost modest, its beauty rooted in proportion and intention rather than ornament. Inside, spaces flowed naturally into one another. Rooms were designed to encourage gathering without forcing it, solitude without isolation. Light moved through the structure deliberately, guided by angles calculated long before electricity had existed. One room in particular carried special weight. Built exactly as shown in the original designs, it connected directly to the concealed entrance leading underground. The passage remained hidden, not through deception, but through subtlety. Only those who knew where to look and why would ever find it. For the brothers, that room served as a reminder. Every meeting held above it, every decision made within those walls rested quite literally on the foundation of responsibility beneath. As the house came into use, it fulfilled the role it had always been intended for. It became a place of collaboration rather than control. Educators, organizers, planners, and builders passed through its doors, drawn not by prestige, but by purpose. Ideas were developed there, refined, challenged, and reshaped. The brothers remained present, but never central, listening more than directing, guiding rather than commanding. Slowly, the story of the land began to surface. Not as a legend of hidden riches, but as a narrative of restoration. Local historians, tracing property records and forgotten archives, began to piece together the life of the man who had once owned everything and then disappeared. His name returned to public memory not as a symbol of excess, but as a figure defined by restraint. Articles appeared, careful and understated, describing his influence and his unusual decision to erase himself from prominence. The brothers did not interfere with this process. They did not claim ownership of the story, nor did they correct every assumption. They understood that history, once released, belonged to everyone. What mattered was that the truth emerged without distortion, that the man's intentions were recognized even if every detail remained unknown. The family tree was eventually confirmed beyond doubt. Records, once thought lost, were rediscovered, connections validated through documents that had survived against probability. The brothers' lineage was no longer a quiet certainty held underground, but a documented reality, acknowledged by scholars and institutions alike. Yet, even then, the brothers resisted the temptation to step forward as heirs. The inheritance had never been about identity. It had been about continuity. Their own transformation unfolded quietly. Wealth did not change how they saw themselves, but it changed how they saw time. They no longer measured life in immediate needs or short-term gains. Their thinking extended forward, toward outcomes they might never witness. The urgency of survival had been replaced by the patience of stewardship. They became careful where they had once been reactive, deliberate where they had once been cautious. The communities they supported continued to evolve. Programs matured. Leadership passed to those who had benefited from them. The brothers stepped back where they could, allowing others to take ownership. Success, they believed, was defined by their eventual irrelevance. When a system functioned without their involvement, they considered it a victory. The land itself remained unchanged in one crucial way. The shed still stood. Its rust deepened, its presence quiet and unremarkable to anyone who passed by. It was never removed, never restored. The brothers understood its importance better than anyone. It was the first threshold, the original test. To erase it would be to deny the path that had led them there. Sometimes they would stand beside it, remembering the moment they first saw it rising unexpectedly from the neglected land. They remembered who they had been then, what they had hoped for, how small their ambitions had seemed in comparison to what followed. the memory did not embarrass them. It grounded them. The house, the land, the underground chambers, the wealth that flowed outward into countless lives, all of it formed a single continuum. Past and future met there, not in conflict, but in alignment. The man who had once vanished had not disappeared at all. He had simply extended himself forward in time, trusting that someone, someday, would understand what he had built and why. As the brothers looked toward the future, they did not wonder what legacy they would leave behind. They already knew the answer. It would not bear their names. It would exist in stability where there had been fragility, in opportunity where there had been barriers, in quiet strength where there had once been neglect. The land that no one wanted had fulfilled its purpose. It had waited. It had revealed itself slowly. And in doing so, it had transformed not only the lives of two brothers, but the meaning of inheritance itself. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More powerful stories, hidden truths, and unbelievable discoveries are already waiting for you in our next videos. Watch the next video now and explore more stories like this on the channel. And don't forget to share this video with someone who loves stories that change everything